Dance around the pot, James, and don't spare the horses.
All aboard!
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. It is showtime. It is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in. I'm Dave Trafford, and a good deal to talk about this week, and we will get to the politics of the day, but we will also begin with the conversation around what's going on in British Columbia this week. As we record, it is the morning of February 12th, Thursday, and there's still a whole lot of information that we don't know about what went on in Tumbler Ridge, but we do know that the mass shooting there at the school left 9 dead and all kinds of speculation. So let's get around the table. John Wright is here. He is the CEO at Canada Pulse Insights. Keith Leslie is our political analyst. You hear and see him on CHTV. Tim Hudak is the former leader of the PC Party, a partner at Counsel Public Affairs here in Toronto, and Kathleen Wynne rounds out the table, former Premier of Ontario. Premier Wynne, you were an education minister. I can only think that your heart beats differently when you hear of this kind of thing happening in a school setting, as we saw in BC.
Just devastating, and just listening to all of the commentary. You know, people just shocked. We think this kind of thing doesn't happen in Canada, but it does. When I was Minister of Education, the C.W. Jeffreys shooting happened. Jordan Manners was killed, and so that was one child, and the whole system was just in shock. So I can't imagine what's going on in Tumbler Ridge. I just think the devastation must be profound. And I was listening to a psychologist this morning talking on CBC about the intergenerational trauma of something like this, especially in a small community where everyone is affected in some way. So this is not something that will go away. When the investigation is over, it will last for years. And I think that we need to, all of us, obviously be aware and thinking about these people, but also examining our own systems and thinking about why this happened, how this happened, and how we can prevent it happening again.
Yeah, Tim, it's as if to Kathleen's point, as if one person died 2,500 times in Tumbler Ridge because everybody is going to have a connection to this, and that is really the effect on this. And I was out playing hockey with the old boys. We play at St. Mike's College School, and the flags at the school were at half staff. So this is being felt in the educational system right across the country.
No, for sure. And we all feel it ourselves, and parents particularly, right? That's the horror of having your child go through that, shot, not survive. Every parent's nightmare is to outlive their kids and then have them snatched away like that. And I think the depths of the sadness and the tragedy we all feel, particularly as the Premier said and you said, in a small community where everybody knows everybody and they will be wounded several times over by loss, family, neighbors, cousins. You got to think too, it moves to anger and second guessing because everybody knows everybody. And that's going to be very painful to go through too, right? Why didn't police do more earlier? Some incident that they saw in the community. There will be lots of stories. The individual, I'm sure, was well known at the town where we're 2,500. Why were mental health services not available? Was involuntary care an option? I think that's going to be the reality, which is even more tragic. You move from the sadness. I think there's going to be a lot of finger pointing and anger in that small town. Yeah,
I was listening this morning, John, and the the folks who are out there, and the question around finger pointing and anger came up. But right now, I think it was still this sense of disbelief and trying to catch your breath in terms of how this was going. And against that backdrop, I've got to say, I'd be the first one to jump up and down about how the media covers stuff. But I think that generally the Canadian media has done a really good, respectful job. I watched Adrian Arsenault last night interview one of the parents, and it was a masterclass in journalistic integrity. She didn't make it about, thoughts and prayers. There was no emotional manipulation, and she's not the only one doing it. I just thought that interview particularly punctuates it. I think our response nationally is kind of interesting to see in terms of how we culturally respond to this versus other jurisdictions, say south of the border.
As a father of four and a husband of in-laws who live in a town of 1,300 people and who ran the newspaper up until just recently when it's going to close its doors, you get a sense, having been married into that incredible family for the last 25 years, because this community was just less than double what that would be. So first of all, everybody does know everybody. Everybody, as transient as they are, have relationships with everybody and know everything. So I can't imagine, but I'm empathetic to what it's like to be in a small town for that. I'm also, as a parent, I can't fathom what it would be like. One of the parents last night simply said that they had built their whole day around seeing their son and daughter come through the door, and was absolutely heartbroken. And these sort of events, thank God, happen rarely in our country. But when they do, whether it be what happened in Quebec on 2 occasions, or even I would say the Humboldt hockey team, something like that sweeps across the nation because not only of the violence that strikes us because we're not used to it, but also just the mere fact that it in often cases it's young people. I would say that I agree with you, Dave, on the whole sensitivity of the media in this, but the only and I would also say that I thought the Prime Minister, I know we look at these things through a political lens, but I thought his reaction to it was tone setting for the day, was genuine. I don't know how previous Prime Ministers would have handled it, but it carried over into the House. I sit at home working, and so I was able to have it on all day and watch what happened. I thought it was a very dignified, empathetic approach to it. I would say, as I have said before in this program, I think the RCMP do an absolutely terrible job of communicating. I know that there's differences in our legal system and everybody's very careful about what you're going to say. I know that in the United States, they would have been out within hours with huge amounts of information and letting people know. And so I'm patient when I watch this, and we have to fill a vacuum with a whole lot of things, but that vacuum is also filled on the internet by a whole lot of other things which may or may not be true. But I think where it hit me the most was in the interview on CBC with one of the parents, the father whose child was killed, and said for 12 hours or so they had no idea whether their kid was there and had been hurt. That just the explanation of waiting for news and counting the ambulances and trying to find out that information. I simply do not understand how you can have a press conference and say nothing, which is often the case with the RCMP, and then to hear from parents that they aren't informed. I think it's unconscionable, and I think it leaves this vacuum for all kinds of other stuff to fill up. So if there is a criticism, I'm consistent with it, and that is the RCMP and most police forces, but particularly the RCMP, are just bereft of media relations sensitivity. And I think in today where, a lie, can be halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on. I mean, this was just remarkably insensitive to filling that void. So that's the only criticism I have, but it's consistent with everything I've said for the last few years.
Yeah, before we came on, Keith, we were talking about your colleague, your former CP colleague, Dean Beebe, who is sort of the wizard of freedom of information requests, and he pointed to the challenges of dealing with the RCMP historically in terms of getting information out of them, even after the fact. And I think, that's where I think the anger comes that Tim was talked about too, that in fact, where will we be in terms of knowing how this played out? You go back to your neighborhood, they're still trying to sift through what the hell happened in Nova Scotia with the mass shooting there. And that's how many years ago, right?
Yeah, and the RCMP did not communicate with the public. They could have been likely to prevent deaths if they just communicated to the public that there was a wild shooter going across half of Nova Scotia. They didn't. They don't appear to have learned much from what we see. John's point is very valid. I saw an interview with another dad from Tumbler Ridge whose younger daughter ended up with some older students locked in an equipment room.
Right.
and they were in there for hours. And he was, of course, obviously grateful that his daughter had survived this, and he didn't want to push her. He was just trying to, figure out how they could both cope with this. But he was in tears because of the other kids. He said he'd watched them grow up. From toddlers, he knew they all know each other in this town. And so it wasn't just that. And the one thing he said, I don't give two shits about the shooter. I care about these kids. And I think that's where the focus needs to be right now. On the aspect of the media coverage of this, and right away, Canadian media were accused of participating in a cover-up with government and police officials because we weren't reporting what was widely being spread online, on social media in particular, on X, on Facebook, about the shooter. And the basic line is, as legacy media, we've always had the tradition and the rule and the guidance, a basic guiding principle of we don't report something unless we can confirm it. And we can't confirm what's being said online. On the other hand, the legacy media, the CBC, CTV, and all, ended up being 12 to 18 hours behind what everyone else knew because it's online. Does that go to undermine the legacy media's credibility when we're so far behind on a story? Even though we can see online, we know what everyone is saying online, but we don't want to report it because we can't confirm it, and we're trying not to have misinformation, or even worse, there was a false person identified right away as the shooter, and someone had to retract that, but after 5,000 hits were spread around. It's such a scary thing. And to John's point, the RCMP could have helped the media a hell of a lot more by answering some questions hours earlier, the day of, as opposed to just, giving nothing, having a news conference and saying virtually nothing. I know people want to make this, as part of the culture war, and that was part of this thing online. And, right away, the Canadian media are, covering all this up. No one was covering it. We're trying to confirm facts, but the RCMP wouldn't confirm anything until noon local time in BC the next day. And even then, you had to, it was like pulling teeth to get some of the answers out of them. What was the relationship, brother? They were just terrible at communicating this all the way along. And apparently, as John said, they were just as bad communicating to the parents in that town, to the whole community itself. So this is shocking in that regard. But the whole event is just so shocking, and it rattles us right to our core. And I felt so much for that dad. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to help his daughter. He doesn't want to push her too far. Doesn't want to make her deal with something she doesn't want to deal with yet. But they're both dealing with the loss of all these other kids in their town. And it's rocked them right to their core. And I agree with you that the Prime Minister's comments did set the right tone for the day. He seemed pretty choked up. And when he talked about how, grandparents and parents and brothers and sisters are going to wake up without a loved one, it hit home.
Yeah. Even in noting, Kathleen, the Prime Minister was dressed in black and a black tie in the legislature yesterday. So, it's a small thing, but it's not a small thing. And I think it really sort of punctuated the moment. But, on the other side of it, to Keith's point, James Wood, the actor, retweeted the misinformation to his 5 million followers. So once that toothpaste is out of the tube, there's no putting it back. And again, I give, to Keith's point, I give the Canadian media all the credit in the world for having the discipline not to follow that, rabbit hole.
Well, yeah. And I think, Keith, I can really hear your frustration in that tension between what happens online and the legacy media, traditional media, mainstream media having to confirm. But man, we need to know where we can go to get information that has been validated. I think it's so important, that discipline that you're talking about, Dave. I think it's so important. There's going to be a backlash anyway in terms of the LGBTQ community. The whole issue around the gender identity of the shooter. I mean, there's no question about that there will be a backlash. I just hope that we can continue to rely on, and I know we can continue to rely on media who take the time and who will tell the story the way it needs to be told, honestly, and as facts are validated. Otherwise we're in a sea of of fake news and finger pointing and blame, and that's not going to help anyone. So I think these next few days are going to be pretty treacherous for the people who are trying to report on this story. And I, to John, to your point about the RCMP, I mean, to me, the unconscionable issue here is that the parents didn't know in decent time. That's just a terrifying reality, and I don't understand it at all. I don't understand it in terms of Nova Scotia, the way that whole story rolled out, and I don't understand it here. And I think that if we can't get to the bottom of that and correct some of those time lags, I think we're just not doing our job as a society.
Tim,
I would also add, I mean, there will be a lot of talk in the next week. I mean, we know the process we're going to go through. It's terrible and it's necessary, but this town will never heal. This is done. This is a gaping hole, which despite our outpouring and our desire to be part of a solution, the fabric is torn apart. It will never heal. And so my concern then is that in a month from now, where are we with those folks? As we would have been at the Polytechnique, and we look at it years later, and we put in things to make sure that the victims and their families are okay. We also have to remember that there were many others who were wounded on that day, injured terribly, and still some fighting for their lives. And clearly from what we see, one little girl probably not make it. So that's my concern for, again, coming from in-laws in a very small town. I can tell you that this will not heal, but we do need to stand carefully beside these people on a prolonged basis, not just for the photo op and the terrible time we're going to live through in the next week.
Well, it's that you bring that up, John and Tim. I wonder, sort of that aftermath is the important time where the important work needs to be done at some place, and to some degree, a lot of people are going to be taken out of their comfort zone. Kathleen Wynne referenced the Jordan Manors shooting, and wasn't shortly after that Roy McMurtry was on the front line, and he was leading the sort of the inquiry into what happened there.
That was the Roots of Empathy report.
Yeah.
Right. And we put money into a focus on youth program in the school boards, and there was a concrete reaction, but it took some time to get there.
Completely. And I think that the patience around that, Tim, is what's required now. And I'm not sure, again, given the media attention, given our general attention spans are in seconds as opposed to minutes or hours, that's going to be the hard part. And I think Premier Eby's probably going to be on the front line having to kind of coordinate that. What kind of advice would you give him?
Stay the course he's on. I think he struck the right tone and reacted immediately, visit the community. I think it's all hands on deck when it comes to support on the social services, health services. Look, that's a wound. It's the deepest of the wounds that never heals for a parent. And I cannot imagine the scar on the psychology of the students in that school who survived. So the earliest intervention possible, I think, is helpful. And then look, ultimately, you can never get closure, but you can take away reminders. And, in St. Catharines in Niagara, that had its own tragedy around the murders of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey, the Bernardo home was eventually bulldozed. And, maybe this is not practical, but I can't imagine those kids walking back into that school again.
Yeah, Keith, it's I reported on the Virginia Tech shooting. It was down there at the university, and every time Virginia Tech comes up, and that was 2007. That's all I can think about. 32 students were shot dead, and I don't know how many dozen others were injured. And the difference being that was a community that was from elsewhere. I mean, that the university community was made up of students who came from all over the United States. Mm-hmm. So they took that trauma back home with them at the time. So to Tim's point, it's really going to be hard to sort of salve that wound.
Obviously, and there's obviously going to be a huge need for mental health and supports But I think this whole issue goes back to, and we really need to get to the core of this, which is guns and mental health. And this young person was well trained with guns, nothing wrong with that. Your family's into hunting. But they also had some mental health issues to the point where the police were called. They were put into a hold where guns were removed from the home. And then when the legal gun owner, I assume that it's not the shooter, but perhaps the mother, we don't know because the RCMP aren't clarifying that point. But when the legal gun owner requested that they be returned to the house, they were. Should they have been? When someone who's had, the police have been called to that house because of mental health issues on several occasions, should guns be returned to that home? And I think that's going to, if the guns weren't available, we might not have had this tragedy that is going to hit everyone in that community for years and years to come. Eventually, I suppose there will be some growth, and the young people are the most resilient of all, but they've been traumatized just going to school. And what's that going to do to them? And will they need to have another school? Do kids want to go back into that? I suspect they will. They don't want to, but they will go in. I suspect, it's just impractical to expect they can get another school built for that community. But it is going to be a tough, traumatic time for a lot of people there. And as I say, the whole issue of mental health and guns needs to be addressed. And I think that would be at the core of any inquiry here. I know people want to get into the LGBTQ aspect of all this. I don't think that's the issue. I think the mental health and the guns are the core of this problem, of this tragedy.
And I think, I think that's right, Keith. And I think that in terms of the investigation, that's where the questions will be. I think the important questions that we can sort of learn from. But I think also that to Tim's point about Premier Eby, I think that the question I would be asking is, okay, what are the supports? What are the emotional, psychological supports that are going to be in place for those kids today? Who's going to be with those families? Who's going to help those families figure out who is going to be in therapy? How are we going to do it? And what's the process going to be in the school? Because Tim, while I agree in terms of walking into the building, those kids are still going to be together wherever they are. They're going to be together, and they need some kind of process that allows them to grieve and mourn. And Premier Eby and his colleagues will be listening, I hope, to the community and to the educators in that school who can help them create a process that will allow those kids to at least do some grieving initially. I mean, those are things that have to happen immediately.
Yeah.
What's also interesting, Premier, I would say this as well. Here's a reporter that, so David Common on CBC was talking to a professor in the United States today. And we do know that how many mass shootings there have been. I mean, there's different definitions of that. There have been 201. One of them has been involved with a trans person. So, I mean, one is too many. But in terms of all of the major mass shootings in the United States this morning, they are already making it out to be a huge thing. 95%, 97% of all of the mass shootings in the United States are perpetrated by men.
Cis men, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And so, I mean, this haunts itself into an agenda, and we're going to hear a lot about it. But numerically, it's nothing.
Right. And in terms of support for those kids, it's about the kids going forward. To the father's point, it's about what's going to happen to those kids now over the weeks and months and years that's going to allow them not to be debilitated by this tragedy, right? How do they find their resilience, and what happens in the next immediate term is important.
Well, it's interesting, John, you're bringing that up around the mass shootings and culturally how we respond to it here in Canada, how we would respond to it in an educational setting versus what goes on in the United States. This is the kind of guy I am. I've got this page bookmarked. It's mass shootings in the United States. We're into day 42 of 2026. There have been 45 mass shootings so far in the U.S. and as of the 10th of February, and it just so happens that on the 10th of February in Sarasota, Florida, 10 people were killed in a mass shooting. And the irony in all of this is, and it's not criticism one way or the other, is the American media is spending more time talking about the shooting in BC than they are talking about 7 dead in Florida. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I need to be educated on, because it was just a bit of a blur with all the media coverage yesterday, but I do not recall whether the president or the vice president of the United States actually sent anything to this country. And again, when you have outreach from around the world, and a lot of that is the personal reputation and relationships that this current prime minister has with those people. Not to say that people wouldn't have said something, but your next door neighbor, because of a cultural dynamic there, is not going to reach out and say anything. Speaks volumes of the difference between the two cultures.
Completely. Speaking on police culture, the bit of a storm last week when it was determined that a number of Toronto police officers were alleged to have been involved in corruption cases. Some have been suspended without pay. It's ongoing. Now it's sort of leaked into the Peel region. This was an investigation done by York region, Keith. And right now we've got a police probe being done by the Inspector General of Policing, a relatively new position here in the province of Ontario. Boy, you know, that against what's happened in BC and the conduct of the RCMP, that's a bad week for policing.
Absolutely. And this probe, I'm not sure why he feels the need, and I guess we'll understand, to do this review on a province-wide basis, as if this corruption problem that we've seen in Toronto and Peel has to be addressed across the province. I mean, is it that serious? Do we have that sort of issues, or is it just to take a review of everyone's practices and supervision practices to make sure this sort of thing isn't going on? But it sort of leaves the impression that this is a problem right across the province. The government, Premier Ford, saying that there's no need for an inquiry into this, I think, well, that's wrong. This policing is one thing by this police agency oversight, but independent office of the policing, is that what it's called? As you say, it's relatively
Inspector General of Policing. Ryan Teschner is the Inspector General. Yeah.
I still think we would need a public inquiry into this, because we want to get to the bottom of this specific case where, I mean, the allegations here are that officers set someone up to be killed, another corrections officer. If that's the case, I mean, we really need to know what's going on here. The whole, as you say, some of them have been suspended without pay, some with pay. There's a couple more being suspended, but not accused of anything yet, not charged with anything yet. So there's a lot more to come here. But the overall feeling is that the police have, they always try to hit us with, it's a few bad apples. Well, what's the rest of that sentence? Mm-hmm. Spoils the whole barrel. This is the problem with the perception, and it's a perception. I think the vast majority of us would agree the vast majority of police are good and honest officers. But when this sort of thing happens and we see this kind of collusion, and we then hear from other officers who say, I tried to point this out, but I had to leave the police because they wouldn't listen to me, and they sent officers and raided my house. There's all this sort of stuff where this blue line shit seems to come into play. And if that's the case, if you're covering for people who are actually committing criminality to the point of lining up murders of a corrections officer, or attempted murder of a correction officer, you've got to give your head a shake. So we really do, I think, need a public inquiry into what's going on here, as well as this review of all the practices, supervision practices of police around the province.
Well, back to your point about the social media and having the challenge of sort of keeping a lid on, the proper confirmed information, John, the idea that, it gets out there into social media. All of a sudden, as soon as this happened, there were names of prominent past police chiefs, people who are on the force here in Toronto being floated around. Oh, I knew for years that he was involved in this and they were involved in that. And that only feeds the fire.
Yeah, I suppose. When I heard what had happened, I thought, sure, there's got to be, an investigation by an outside party, whether it be the RCMP or the OPP, to kind of make sure that something, is done in a fair way. But we all have, at some point, access to the facts. I mean, look, the government can't even set up an inquiry to find out where $15 billion has gone over the last many years on a rail transit problem that we all know exists, and they know exactly what had happened. So the only thing I thought was for the investigation to now be about all of the police departments, all of the police forces in the province, I thought was complete overreach. I mean, honestly, to goodness, where are you going to get the resources? How long is this going to take? Is it really a crying need to go through and shore up the confidence of the province on policing when in fact it's happened in downtown Toronto and it's affected one? it just seems like, and what are you going to end up with, and how long is it going to take? What are we looking at? 3 years, 4 years, and then there's going to be debates over what is produced and what is not produced, and evidence and this, and kind of like they won't produce some stuff because people will claim that it isn't based on evidence and may be prejudicial to some kind of a case. I mean, no one asked for the entire province to be audited by somebody who doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot, anyways, from my own perspective. So I thought that the response to this was, and I'm sure that there is a need for introspection on this, but does it mean that every time something happens with two police forces that we, require an inquiry? Maybe, who knows? I think that, however, what's being put on the table is overkill, overreach, and I don't know what it's going to accomplish at the end of the day. So I was absolutely surprised when it was put forward.
Overreach, Tim? Overreach, Tim?
Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. In my experience, and be curious to the premiers and Keith and John as longtime, viewers of the legislature. Sometimes you got to watch the watchdogs, right? And there will be some like auditor generals and ombudsmen that do an outstanding job, fighting for people, making sure that tax dollars are spent wisely, exposing processes that are gone awry and fixing them to deliver better services. And then there'd be others that seem more interested in maximizing their camera time and, would exaggerate and think undermine the office. I don't know the Inspector General. This is the first. It's a new office, as was pointed out. But it seems to me by going broad like that, is it a bit grandiose and more about ego than it is about getting to the root. Now, if there are dots to be connected to other police departments outside of Toronto and York, by all means. But I think you'd start with where the problem is. You find evidence, then you expand. Otherwise, this has the negative sides of those public inquiries and such that drag on for years, are way over budget. And by then, the world has moved on. Two things I wanted to point out here, if I could, Dave, on this. If I understand the story correctly, one thing that we need to encourage and protect is the victim here in the targeted shooting, who I understand was in charge, a corrections officer in charge of one prison where they had a real torrent of drugs and weapons and cell phones and other contraband getting into prisons. And he cleaned it up, right? He had his sergeants and he got that down to a trickle. And they attacked him because that cut off millions of dollars of revenue back to the gangs. And he would separate gang members in prison. That's the kind of person you want running these things. So how do we reward that and protect it? And number two, I was happy with the pivot of the Toronto Police Association. Often you'll see unions or associations that will say the bad apples, right? Yeah, we got a few bad apples, but the rest are really good. And I think that's nonsense when they say it. It's like, you fly in an airline that said, all of our pilots are pretty good except the ones who crash into mountains from time to time. And they got out of the gate by, talking about legal process and protecting their members, and I think they must have slept on it, because the next day they came out in partnership with the chief, talking about how, horrified they were of this. They want to get to the bottom of this. They want to make sure that, anybody that's caught in any kind of crime is nowhere near a badge. That kind of pivot and having the association work hand in hand with the chief or chiefs to root out any kind of corruption, that was a good move, and I'm glad to see they pivoted.
Well, Kathleen, on that point, though, we're hearing the police association here in Toronto complaining that they are not being included in the consultation in terms of this broader investigation. The associations themselves would probably have some, considerable insights into what's gone on.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And I really agree with Tim in terms of the tone between the union and the chief and the system. I think that was a really, really good thing. And it was kind of unusual, which I think made it even more significant. So, but I have to say, I actually don't think this is overreach. I think that there's a systemic nature to this, and I don't know if it's if the way into it is the CPIC, the Canadian Police Information Center, where it seems like there were abuses around that for sure, and it may be that there's more known about that than we know. So I don't think it's a bad thing that this office is taking a look at the system because of those systematic aspects of this story. And I think if those weren't there, then I would agree. But I think, we can't say that this isn't just about bad apples and then say that we don't need to look at the system. And the system goes beyond just one or two police services. And I think that it makes sense to at least ask the question about whether there are systematic abuses across the entire system in the province.
We're more than halfway through our session here, John, and we haven't mentioned Donald J. Trump. But considering everything else that's gone on, we've talked about.
Yeah, what time is it?
Exactly. I thought the irony this week was that he has picked a fight with Canada over the symbol of elbows up, Gordie Howe. I mean, Gordie was he was the master of elbows up. And to think that somehow the Chinese were going to come in and take hockey away and steal the Stanley Cup, and he even took a shot at
the NHL.
Well, yeah, and he even took a shot at Premier Ford, and in that same post around the bridge, saying they still refuse to put our liquor on their shelves, and pointing out Ontario. The whole question around the bridge, who owns the bridge, etc. I think that this might be more of a pivot point in the Canada-U.S. relationship than we would have otherwise considered.
I don't think so. And I get that Gordie Howe hat trick, right? Like the goal, the fight, penalty. I think the reaction from Canada was quite different this time, and I think a lot of it is that we're just used to it. It was just like an absorption.
Well, that's what I mean. We're ignoring the president.
Yeah, it was just kind of like, everybody listened and went, yeah, whatever. And then the prime minister very calmly says, well, I called him and corrected him, and we'll see you later. I mean, there's no readout. There's nothing. It's just like, yeah, let's move on. So let me say just the following things. I thought, first of all, we are absorbing this. The second thing was the report on CNN yesterday where they had how Canadians are viewed and how Americans view Canadians and all that. And it's all very good. But our own tourism is down 25%, and I don't think that's going to come back anytime soon, and because of what we see, especially ICE, that sort of stuff. But the third thing was the announcement this morning that Gallup has ceased to report its presidential approval ratings, that it has made up some excuse that, they don't want to focus on individuals anymore in the political process, but that ends 80 years of approval process reporting. Now, if I were at that firm, I don't know what pressure has been brought to bear, because they just recently put out a report saying that that President Trump is at 36% support, which is below some of the others that are reporting around 40 or whatever. So I'm not going to speculate that pressure has been brought to bear, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of contracts and a lot of heat that could be brought to bear, and even lawsuits. So I would hope that behind the scenes they're going to continue to do it so that they have a string attached to it, so that when this president is gone, or if he's gone, they can continue to then, join it up to where it was. But we are moving on with our trade relationships, with trying to survive. I will say this as well. I had a friend of mine who afterwards called me and said, you're Canadians, the economy's in the toilet up there. You should be doing more with us. And it was kind of like, yeah, but you're causing this. We lost 51,000 manufacturing jobs because it's being sucked south of the border. So we just got to keep moving on. The prime minister is getting accolades in the public opinion polls for doing so. There is a patience in the land amongst 2/3 that say we should, be careful and wait for what we're designing. But I think the turning point really, Dave, was not so much, whether we're going to do something about it, but was really kind of like mañana, and just moving over to another issue.
Yeah, Tim, that was sort of the point that occurred to me this week. We've talked often, when Trump is gone, the presidency in and of itself, the institution of the presidency has been so diminished. It's going to take a whole lot of work to actually rehabilitate the image and the tradition and history of the presidency in the United States, if for no other reason than world leaders are ignoring what's coming out of the Oval Office. And I realize it's all attached to Trump, but it's really easy then, as John says, we're going over here now. And all of a sudden, the shift in relationships, all of those things have become fundamental. So for me, I think it was, universally a point in Canada with the bridge issue. We laughed about it, but where it really punctuated that issue for the presidency and our relationship with America.
Yeah, I got a different view on your question, and I'll come back to the bridge. Like I think anybody who replaces President Trump is easily going to score much higher on the dignity level and have better relationships. On the converse, I think the tariffs are here to stay, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican. There might be more fair deals that are better negotiated, but I just think it's part of I think it's a shift that Trump has made after 60 years post World War II. 80 years post World War II. There's an American impatience with carrying the world on its back, and they make it connect to loss of manufacturing jobs and self-determination, whether you agree with that or not. But here's why I think this is important. It's not really how Canadians feel or how international bodies feel about this bridge thing. It's how Americans feel, right? That's the spot. And when President Trump can tap into American resentment that other countries are stealing auto jobs or agricultural jobs because we won't let their products in, or even the digital sales tax that attacked American companies, I think he has some sympathy among a segment of the American population. But the bridge in a swing state like Michigan, is seen as an economic lifeline. It makes life easier to get across faster. They'll have a sense of ownership of that bridge as well. So Trump's misstep here was, I don't think, is the Canadian part. It was actually attacking the core voter support that want to see a pro-American policy. And when Michiganders would say, this is our baby. And then, of course, the nutty stuff you talked about with China stealing Stanley Cup and all that. So that is, I think, the promising sign there. And then you see, around the same time, the House voting to repeal the tariffs, which they have a right to do. They're not past the veto level yet, as was pointed out, but it's a sign of momentum. And let's not forget, right, the groundwork that has been happening from the premiers, from the prime ministers, and importantly, our person on the ground, David Patterson, is doing an awesome job in Washington, D.C., working congressmen, working senators, working governors. I think a lot of that's behind the vote, and it's in the right direction.
Yeah, Kathleen, the whole idea of this relationship, as Tim points out, being the bilateral trade, et cetera. One of the things that gets lost in this conversation, it's the first public-private partnership that involved cross-border infrastructure, for the one thing, that Canada put up the money to build it initially. We will recover that money through the tolls, and then once we do, that gets split with Michigan. So all of those details got lost in the fray on this. But I saw an interview with one of the automaker sector industry representatives in Detroit, and his eyes are just rolling in the back of his head, just saying, we can't afford not to have that stuff coming across the border. We can't afford not to have those parts coming from Windsor. We can't not afford to have it coming back into Windsor from Detroit. Otherwise, it's just going to kill us. And then in the short term, to Tim's point, I think that's the pain point for the president.
Yeah. And, I was premier. Rick Snyder was the governor of Michigan. We worked on getting this bridge. I mean, there was a whole issue around the owner of the Ambassador Bridge, Matty Maroon, and not wanting a new bridge. I mean, it was a mess. It was a really messy process. But at the core of it, Dave, was there needed to be a more secure and uncongested way for parts to get across and product to get across and people to get across, because that's the other thing. There are people from Detroit and Michigan who go across that bridge to work. That is how they make their living. There's such an integrated economy between the two cities, let alone the two provinces and the two countries. So that was at the core of this. And I think, the president, whether he didn't understand that or whether distracting from whatever other messes he's in, which are lots, was more important than actually understanding the issue for the Americans. That's the point that he missed. That's where he lost this discussion. And I think the way the prime minister didn't respond publicly really, and then just explain to the president what was going on. I think that's exactly what we needed to do in this moment, because the story was so clearly that this is a piece of infrastructure that's needed. It's something that Canada supported and paid for, and is going to benefit both jurisdictions. And that's what came out. That was sort of the bottom line once the mess cleared.
Well, Keith, the other side of the story is that the New York Times was reporting, a few hours after the troll social post came out was that Lutnick was meeting with the owner of the Ambassador Bridge and obviously put that bug in the president's ear. And all of a sudden, the president's standing up because, his billionaire buddy in Detroit wants to make sure that his interests are protected. The Democrats are already playing that in terms of, here we are, while people are having a hard time with affordability and making rent and all these sorts of things. President's here taking care of a billionaire family who wants exclusive rights to all the tolls crossing into the U.S. from Canada.
Well, apparently, Mr. Maroon was meeting in the White House with Mr. Lutnick, and then Trump got on the phone with Mr. Maroon. Clearly, neither man explained to Mr. Trump the realities of the situation, because that's what struck me when I first saw that Truth Social post from Donald Trump, was how remarkably ill-informed it was. Mm-hmm. They're not using American steel. They're not using American labor. We should own half the bridge. Well, A, you will, and B, they are using American steel in America. Like, all this was negotiated out. I believe he was there when he fast-tracked the project in 2017, I believe, and spoke about bridging united countries and all this kind of nonsense. I mean, clearly, it just was the last guy in his ear. It happened to be this billionaire lobbyist saying that, hey, the Ambassador Bridge has only been around since 1929. We don't need to twin that. We can keep doing. No, it's a lifeline. And Premier Wynne pointed out, Governor Schneider, the former governor, he came out last night and explained, just laid it right out, what an economic case there was for this bridge and what a huge benefit would be to Detroit, to Michigan, and to the United States, as well as to Canada and Ontario. So it was just shocking to see that he was, I say, even for Donald Trump, it was remarkably ill-informed. The thing Premier Wynne as well mentioned about the laborers going back and forth across the Detroit-Windsor border. We learned during COVID, hundreds and hundreds of nurses a day go from Windsor to work in Detroit. You really want to cut that off? Your healthcare system, for what it is dependent on Ontario nurses.
Just before we go, and we kind of kicked around the idea of whether or not we need an inquiry vis-a-vis police, the question this week, and it's certainly catching momentum here in Toronto, but I think it is a broader question for the province, Tim, as to whether or not we really need a deep dive into what the hell happened with the Crosstown.
Yeah, you got to do something, right? It is a debacle in cost, the lack of communication. So I think Metrolinx, basically had to run everything through the government. And as a result, I suspect projects were delayed. Facts did come out. It increased the frustration of taxpayers who pay the bill or were looking forward to being on it. I can be a bit jaundiced on the whole full public inquiry just because they can be themselves an example of cost overruns and being way over time. But I think a incisive and public examination of the way contracts were structured, dispute mechanisms, why did they lead to higher cost, delays, paralysis, and the lack of ability, I think, of Metrolinx to actually put the facts out there as well. We do need to shine a light on that and correct it. We're building the Ontario line now. It's great. It's wonderful to see these investments in our transportation system, 413. But man, if we don't understand the deep malfunction, in the contracts and dispute mechanisms, we're going to have this experience all over again.
And John, this applies across the province. I know in the past you've said this is sort of a Toronto issue and who cares about Eglinton in terms of the way the transit runs. True. But every taxpayer in Ontario at some degree is paying for this in as much as we're supporting Metrolinx. And the hue and cry around, well, what the hell happened? We didn't seem to learn anything from what happened in Ottawa. And there was some level of inquiry there. Now I realize it's a different circumstance, but boy, clearly this needs to be uncovered.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree more with Tim. I mean, we've talked about it so much on this program. And as I said before, the people in Eganville don't really care about the link in the line, and they are focused maybe on Ottawa because they see what happens there. But this is hugely, hugely important to get to the bottom of it. It's the only thing I can think of is that there's just so much correspondence going back and forth to the Ontario government that's the last thing that wants to become public. So that may be a barrier, but frankly, this is well suited for inquiry. No question.
Yeah, Kathleen Wynne, the idea that we would want to do this, I think, and we've talked about this before, one of the things that will become apparent, abundantly clear, as soon as you start to rip the layers back, is that the public-private partnership model was probably not the right one for this large of a transit project.
Well, maybe not the way it was configured. And I said this on John Moore earlier this week. I mean, I'm pretty sure if there's a public inquiry, there are going to be fingers pointed at Dalton McGuinty. There'll be fingers pointed at me. There'll be fingers pointed at Doug Ford. And so, I think that is what it is. I think in terms of the public policy and the future of building infrastructure in the province, we do need a process. So Tim's not keen on a full public inquiry, but I think the aspect of being able to compel witnesses, of having the process in public, which is, those are kind of hallmarks of a public inquiry. I would like to see those in place because we need answers. There have been some lessons learned in terms of the way the Ontario line is being set up. I think that there are smaller chunks being procured rather than the whole thing being procured at once. I think that's the way it's been organized. I don't know the details of that, obviously, but I think there have been some lessons learned in terms of that procurement process. But, we need to understand what happened with the communication. Why weren't the Metrolinx folks more open about what was going on? Was it that the government wasn't allowing them? Was it that there were things going on that shouldn't have been going on, and so they didn't want to talk about it? Who knows? But we need answers to those questions. And so whatever the process is, it needs to be public, and people need to be compelled to say what they know about the process. So I think we need, if a public inquiry is the way to do that, then I think we should have it.
Yeah, and
not getting any communication out of Metrolinx all along. I mean, if you think back to last year, Metrolinx put an AI program in charge of its X feed, and it started talking about sending GO trains to Vancouver. So that's the last real communication we had from Metrolinx. Clearly, they need some more vice presidents. Or I've mocked them about this before, and I will continue to mock them about this. How can they have any communication within themselves when they've got so many vice presidents running who knows what? It's just such a massive organization, and no one can communicate. And that's the bottom line here. $6 billion over budget. 15 years. It's just insanity. And as I say, maybe their AI program can give us a better explanation because no one else can be able to communicate.
Keith, I'm surprised you didn't swear again. You've sworn twice on this pod. I would think on this one we would hear profanity for sure.
I was close.
Well, but here's
radio training in me. It's hard for me to swear. It's just that old radio training.
Can we start the petition to have Keith Leslie lead the inquiry into this matter?
That's a great idea.
That's right. We could do it right here. But I think you nailed it, Keith. The idea here is, and the public-private partnership issue will be, at the heart of the conversation. But let's face it, Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx hold the pen on this project, and they are the ones who have failed up. To your point around too many VPs, over and over and over again. There is a track record of failure in both cases, and I seriously think that we need to kind of dig in on that.
Okay, I just need to insert this that one of the reasons that, because I wasn't predisposed and our government wasn't predisposed to love public-private partnerships, but what we found was building a hospital. You could do it on time, on budget, even under budget. You could get it done. A building on a site that seems to work. Yeah. It's these big transit projects that seem to get out of control. And I, as a policy wonk, I want to know why. What is it that happens in that difference between building a building and building a transit project? So we need answers to that question. And I will just say, and anyone who worked in the Ministry of Transportation when I was minister or when I was premier will know that it was a bee in my bonnet all along that we could not get Metrolinx to communicate with the public. I couldn't even, when I was Minister of Transportation, I had a huge fight with Metrolinx, even about putting up information on the hoarding around a project. Because I thought in a neighborhood where there's disruption, it would be really helpful for people to know what was going on. And there was resistance to even doing that. So there was a culture of not communicating that I don't think has been improved over the last 10 years. And so that is something that has to be tackled as well. Because when people know what the problem is, they're way more open to accepting it than if they're not being told.
Yeah, and I think you're right in terms of there are places now it's clear where the P3 works. The hospitals are a great example of it. Some schools across the country are a good example. By the way, the Gordie Howe Bridge, a very good example of how the public-private partnership works. But I come back to it's not about the P3. It's about how it was implemented, managed, to Tim's point, how the conflict resolution, procedures were in place, and how do we determine whose throat to choke on.
Right, but there's a big danger of the baby being thrown out with the bathwater here, because then it becomes, well, private, public. And I always say that, like I was talking about this with my class this week. And, for them, these young people, it came down to the private sector should never be involved in anything. And I had to say to them, we wouldn't have a railway across this country if there weren't private money that was willing to step up and take the risk and innovate. So it's just not realistic to think that there's not going to be private sector partnership in some way. But that can't be the only conversation. There are other things that were going on, and that's what we need to get to the bottom.
And all the more reason why we need an inquiry.
I agree.
Right. All right. Well, there we go.
I'm not heading it.
You're not heading it. All right. Well, we'll find other work for you, Keith. You got to go shovel the snow, I understand. So there
I am indeed. I've been postponing it till this was over.
There we go. All right. Well, that'll do it for us this week. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Thanks to Keith Leslie, Tim Hudak, John Wright, Kathleen Wynne, and thanks to you for joining us for this episode. And by the way, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button, the follow button. And I get questions all the time. If I subscribe to it, does it cost anything? No, it doesn't cost a thing. You just hit the button and you'll get notifications as to when the next show is available. Same thing happens if you listen on your audio podcast platforms, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, etc. So if you've got a comment, a thought on this, feel free. You can always offer up the comments on YouTube. You can do that on the podcasts as well. Anyway, thanks for joining us. Enjoy your weekend. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.